Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this new episode in our event series entitled Unpacking Turkish Foreign Policy. Today's episode is going to be looking at the role that Turkey plays in European security. Turkey never seems to be out of the news these days for many different reasons, but among them, of course, Turkey's potential role in a future European security architecture, a new one, Turkey's role in the negotiations or discussions that are going on between Russia and Ukraine. We know today, perhaps not now, but later today, there will be another meeting in Istanbul between the two delegations. Turkey's role in the Black Sea region, and many other issues. So I think it's a great moment to actually talk about these with a great group of experts that I'm joined with today, who I will introduce now very briefly. First of all, Ambassador Tacan Ildem, who's a former Assistant Secretary General of NATO, a former Turkish ambassador to NATO, among many other ambassadorial posts, and is also chairman of the Turkish think tank Ildem. So welcome to you, Ambassador Ildem. Ben Hodges, who is not a stranger to our events on Turkey, who's a retired Lieutenant General and former commander of NATO Allied Land Command and former Commanding General of the US Army in Europe, and is also affiliated with a number of different European and American think tanks, and who is a very often a commentator on issues related to the war in Ukraine and security and other issues. Oana Lungescu, who is senior advisor at the EPC on issues related to NATO and security and defense, and who is the former NATO spokesperson. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Murat Seyrek, who is adjunct professor at the Brussels School of Governance and a non-resident academic fellow at the EPC. So welcome to all of you. To the audience, welcome again. Please put your questions either by writing it in the comment or question box. I'm never quite sure which one it is actually, or by clicking on the hand icon. I would like to ask you to put your questions sort of early on, so I can already feed these into our panelists as we go through the conversation to make it more sort of interactive. But I want to start off with my first question to you, Ambassador. Perhaps it's a very basic question, but I'm still going to ask it. After all these decades of Turkish membership of NATO, how important is NATO membership for Ankara, and how does Turkey see a potential reduced US commitment within NATO, but within European security more broadly, which is something that has been mentioned several times by President Trump and others? How would Turkey view that?
Well, first of all, thank you for your invitation. It's great to be here today, virtually joining to the distinguished panelists whom I cherish the good memories of the past. Well, NATO remains the cornerstone of Turkey's security and defense policy as one of the alliance's oldest and most strategically positioned member state. Turkey regards its NATO membership not only as a vital security guarantee, but also a platform through which it actively contributes to NATO's three core tasks: collective defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. Your question was also related to potential reduction of US commitment. Such a reduction in the US commitment would be for many NATO allies a source of concern, and definitely it will be a source of concern for Ankara, since such a shift could risk weakening transatlantic bonds, undermining unity and cohesion within the alliance, and also eroding the alliance's credibility in deterrence and defense. Turkey would likely advocate for maintaining and further strengthening NATO's political unity and solidarity, and elevating its military readiness, agreeing on the importance of burden sharing, which would be something that our leaders would be discussing in The Hague during their summit meeting. And certainly, while loyal to commitments within NATO, Ankara may also hedge against uncertainties by pursuing policies to enhance its regional diplomacy and to broaden its network of defense partnerships, including bilateral and multilateral arrangements beyond NATO structures. But again, NATO commitments would be important for Turkey to stick to. But in sum, I can say that NATO will remain to be a cornerstone of Turkey's defense and security, and Turkey would be advocating the maintenance of the alliance with its political unity, cohesion, and solidarity.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to come back a bit later on the issue of Turkey's policy of hedging, because it's something that's talked about increasingly these days, particularly vis-a-vis Russia. But I want to come to you, Ben. I mean, you've been working on issues related to security all your life, and you were obviously posted as well in Turkey at one point. So I'd like to hear from you, how would you assess actually the importance of Turkey for European and transatlantic security, and are Turkey's core geopolitical interests and its vision of international security, are they still aligned with NATO? Because to be honest, there has been some frictions over the years between Turkey and some of its allies in NATO, and some, I mean, for example, the situation vis-a-vis Finland, but not only. So how would you view Turkey's contribution and its alignment with all of our NATO members?
Well, first of all, Turkey is essential. I don't even want to think about NATO without Turkey. You know, a brand new lieutenant can look at the map and immediately recognize the geographical position, the importance of Turkey to the alliance and to the region. But I think I don't defend some of the criticisms against Turkey that I think are legitimate, although you could probably point to several countries, and now, embarrassingly, even my own country, on some things that are unacceptable in democratic societies. So I'm reluctant to point the finger at anyone else inside the alliance. But I think we also in the West have failed to appreciate, and again, I'm not defending anything, the fact we have failed to appreciate Turkey's position in the world. And when I was stationed in Izmir at the NATO Land Command, and by the way, there's been a NATO headquarters in Izmir longer than any other place in all of NATO except for Naples. So Turkey has been a contributing member of the alliance since way back then. When I was there, I went up to Ankara for a meeting with a senior member of the Turkish General Staff. And I walked in, I said, "Sir, good morning. How's it going?" And he started off by saying, "Ben, I tell you what, I wake up in the morning, I have Russia to the north, Iran, Iraq, Syria to the south, the Balkans to the west, and the Caucasus to the east. It's a hell of a neighborhood." And I kind of laughed. And then I thought, you know, if you go in almost any map in any headquarters in Europe, the Black Sea and Turkey are down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. Just like, you know, Svalbard and the top of Norway is in the top left corner of the map. The problem with that is it affects how we think about things. But if you take the Black Sea and move it up to the middle of the map, then you start thinking about Turkey in the region in a completely different way. And so what Turkey has done with its support for Ukraine, refusing to accept Russia's annexation of Crimea, for example, for its own reasons, its enforcement of Montreux so that Russia could not bring new ships up into the Black Sea. At the end of the day, we are much better off with them than without them.
Thank you, Ben. Oana, do you agree with Ben? Do you think that Turkey has sometimes been underappreciated? And do you think sometimes that Turkey's geopolitical position has impacted NATO's regional security priorities?
I think that's the case all the time for the reasons that Ben has just outlined. Turkey is one of the strongest proponents in NATO of what is rather clunkily known as the 360-degree approach to security, which basically means dealing with all threats from all directions. And Turkey has rightly pointed out in the past that Russia, for instance, is not just in the east. Russia is also in the south, and Russia is in many other parts of the world, basically surrounding and directly impacting with the Euro-Atlantic area. So it's also been Turkey one of the main reasons, actually probably the main reason, why NATO's strategic concept refers to two main threats to the alliance. One being Russia as the most significant and direct threat, and the other one being terrorism as the most direct asymmetric threat. And of course, Türkiye has suffered the most terrorist attacks of any NATO ally, and often reminds allies of that reality. So it's had those realities recognized by allies. On the other hand, of course, issues such as terrorism have also, and Turkey's perception of how to deal with terrorism have also posed some significant stumbling blocks to the alliance. For instance, back in 2019, I think both Tacan and Ben will remember when Turkey basically blocked the so-called graduated response plans, NATO's defense plans, wanting in exchange a recognition that the YPG and PYD offshoots of PKK and Syria were also, and Iraq, supported by the United States at the time, should also be designated as terrorist organizations. Eventually, that blockage was resolved. But again, as you mentioned, Amanda, the issue of terrorism came up again when Finland and Sweden applied to join. And in particular for Sweden, it led to some very, very tough negotiations with Sweden ultimately adjusting its constitution, its legislation on dealing with terrorism, but also lifting the ban on exports of arms to Turkey. So all these things, in a way, have got very much entangled because you've had arms exports, but also the import by Turkey itself of the S-400 missile system from Russia. And sometimes they've been very complicated. They've made up for a very complicated mix in achieving consensus within NATO. But ultimately, I think there is a recognition of the massive geostrategic importance of Turkey in the alliance. Right now, Turkey and Sweden sit side by side around the NAC table. And next year, it is Turkey which will host the next NATO summit.
Thank you. I think it's true that what you mentioned, basically Turkey has ruffled some of the feathers of different NATO members over the years, although it's not the only NATO member to have ruffled some feathers, but because of the geopolitical importance of Turkey, they always manage to find a way through. But I'd like to continue this with you, Murat, because in addition to this ruffling of feathers, Turkey has also sort of developed a foreign policy which has a sort of bigger focus on strategic autonomy and is increasingly seen as being very transactional. What do you think the impact of this could be further on the alliance, and will it actually further potentially sort of disrupt the alliance further functioning in the future in any way? I mean, we've seen Turkey, for example, try to join or wanted to join or invited to join BRICS and all sorts of other partnerships. How does this all impact its relations on the alliance?
Well, the desire for strategic autonomy is not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's managed well, and we shouldn't expect all allies to agree on every foreign policy issue. Allies have different regional interests. And in a way, we need to see that this is the reality of the world, and this is the case for many different allies. That's normal. The real question is how well an ally can coordinate this with others and strike a good balance so that its actions don't regularly go against the broader interests of the alliance. And about the transactionalism, I don't see it as a deliberate foreign policy choice. It's more the result of not having a clear long-term strategy for a country. When that's missing, countries fall back on transactional relationships. It becomes a necessity, not a preference. This might suit the current government's approach, but I believe it creates serious long-term challenges, both for Turkey, but also for its relations with its allies. I mean, all fellow speakers already talked about the importance of Turkey. I fully believe so as well. I mean, one should have lost his or her mind to talk about NATO without Turkey. But on the other hand, we need to talk about challenges too. And there are some major challenges. In fact, the problem goes deeper than just transactionalism or strategic autonomy. I'm not sure the current government has a consistent foreign policy at all. That's a bigger issue. Predictability really matters, especially in foreign policy and especially for a country with such important allies. But lately, what we have seen from Turkey signals rather unpredictability and inconsistency. And this brings me to three key pillars I believe really matter today for NATO-Turkey relations and broadly NATO-Turkey-West relations as well. The first is predictability, and the second is trust. Unfortunately, there are big challenges here as well. I mean, just an example, one of my students recently wrote her thesis on NATO and intelligence sharing, and I was reading and evaluating it last night. And when she discussed trust issue among allies, unfortunately, almost all the negative examples were about Turkey. That's rather sad. And we also need to be fair. Trust is a two-way street, and there have been mistakes on both sides, as Oana also mentioned. There were also certain actions from different allies in Turkey's region as well without taking Turkey's positions. But still, trust remains a major concern. And the third pillar that we haven't discussed yet is democracy. Of course, NATO is not the EU, and no one expects perfect democratic standards from all members. That hasn't been the case in the history either. And yes, we see democratic challenges in many places, even in the US nowadays, unfortunately. But some basic democratic principles like rule of law and fundamental rights remain essential. And democracy is still a key part of what sets NATO apart from authoritarian countries like Russia. That's why the erosion of democracy in Turkey, and especially recent developments after the arrest of Istanbul Mayor İmamoğlu, raise serious concerns. They affect how Turkey is perceived within the alliance and shape how others view its future direction. These three issues, predictability, trust, and democracy, are not just abstract principles. They directly impact actually how well NATO can function, how Europe's future security architecture is shaped. Turkey should take them seriously, and I genuinely believe that despite all these challenges, actually, the current global situation offers a major opportunity for Turkey. The country still matters a lot, as we have seen its role in Russia-Ukraine context as well. But let's be honest, Turkey is not living up to its full potential, actually not at all. Take the UK, for example. Despite leaving the EU, it has re-emerged as a central actor in European security. It's working closely with the key EU member states and showing leadership. And Turkey could do the same. It has the potential to become one of the top 4 or 5 key players shaping European security, not just as a partner, but as a leader. And sadly, this current path is holding it back. Turkey is really missing a huge opportunity there. And Turkey will always be an important actor in the region, but whether it takes a seat at the top table as a leader country together with countries like France, Germany, and the UK, it's up to Turkey. And let's not forget, such a role can bring real political, economic, and military advantages for the country as well. So I truly hope that the government recognizes this before the window of opportunity closes.
Thank you, Murat. I think these are very excellent points that you raised, and very challenging as well for the allies. Perhaps there's a perception in Ankara that it already has somewhat of a seat at the top table, at least when it comes to the war in Ukraine, because as I mentioned earlier, it's in Istanbul where the next round of negotiations is taking place today. But I do agree with you that all of these issues erode confidence in Turkey, although I have to say the issue of trust, we could also apply that to the United States now. I'm not sure that they are any better, and probably much worse. But I want to stay on the topic of Ukraine because it's important, and I want to come back to you, Ambassador. Could you assess, I mean, in your review, how important for Turkey is an independent and sovereign Ukraine? How important is it for Turkey that Ukraine comes out of this war victorious? And how important of a security partner is Turkey for Ukraine in this respect?
First of all, we have to remember that when Russia illegally and illegitimately annexed Crimea in 2014, Turkey was in the forefront of countries not recognizing this annexation. And since then, Turkey has been insisting on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. It is something we should never give up as Europeans, because if we are going to have a new European security architecture, it should be underpinned by fundamental principles, including respect to sovereignty and territorial integrity of independent states, inviolability of international recognized borders, and also for these countries to be able to make their sovereign decision to either join or not join a military alliance. Therefore, Turkey really wishes to see at the end of the negotiating process a settlement which would not give the occupied territories to Russia, but see the return of these territories back to Ukraine's control and sovereignty, part of its sovereignty. And Turkey really believes that if a precedent is created, it will be damaging for any European security architecture for the future. I mean, we have heard the highest level statements coming from Turkey, stating that any settlement should ensure return of the occupied territories. Since the start of the war in Ukraine in February since 2022, Turkey has been supportive of Ukraine's war efforts by procurement of critical equipment, including UAVs, and also expanded its cooperation in different spheres, but defense cooperation as well, defense industry cooperation as well. Now there are joint venture projects between the two countries. And I have to say that sometimes Turkey's role has been mis-evaluated. There were certain misunderstandings regarding Turkey's stand vis-à-vis the ongoing war. I remember when I was invited to a webinar organized by a European institution, when I asked who else would be a speaker in addition to me, they told me that there would be an Indian professor. And I couldn't understand. They said, well, since we covered the Western position and Russian position, it is time to go for non-aligned countries. And I was surprised because the person talking with me was a former NATO country ambassador to NATO. And eventually, I was the only speaker because I didn't accept that format. Turkey's engagement with Russia has been a long-lasting one, and it is out of necessity. Don't forget that we are in the same neighborhood, and we, throughout history, fought against Russia in different times. So we know what Russia stands for. And but in any case, in all conflict areas, be it Syria, Karabakh, or Libya, Russia is there. And even for the conflicting purposes, Turkey had to have an engagement, purposeful engagement, with a view to eliminating some of the potential dangers on the ground. Therefore, we should not jump to conclusions, and it was the case in some European quarters to label Turkey as pro-Russian. I mean, we can be from different political affiliation in Turkey, but in any case, putting aside the procurement of S-400s, which according to me was a strategic mistake, the policy that the government has so far implemented vis-à-vis the war in Ukraine has been consistent and I should say accurate. Regarding few points which was raised as to Turkey being a spoiler, I have to remind all of us that the discussion on the accession of Finland and Sweden was so important for all allies, including Turkey. But Turkey also had the right to voice its legitimate concerns when it comes to terrorism. And Oana is right. There are two main sources of threat, Russia and terrorism as defined in NATO's strategic concept of 2022. And we cannot just shy away from our responsibilities when it comes to how counterterrorism should be done in individual allied nations. If they find sanctuary in some of allied countries, then of course there is a need to change legislation. And this is, I think, the value added of the trilateral cooperation that Sweden, Finland, and Turkey put in place with coordination among different government agencies with a view to coming to the same page with the same understanding as to how to deal with one of the main sources of threat, terrorism.
Thank you, Ambassador. Do you, Ben? Do you agree? Do you think that sometimes Turkey is sometimes misunderstood, or it has to continue its different types of engagement with Russia out of necessity? I mean, for example, is it really necessary to continue having energy cooperation? Is it necessity? Turkey has been accused of helping Russia circumvent European sanctions. Is it really out of necessity, or is there a sort of a sense of opportunism as well in this approach to gain something from maintaining ties with both sides, so to speak?
So as I said at the start of the first question, we have failed to appreciate Turkey's geography and their security concerns and to respect those. And I think there is a tendency to focus on Turkey's sins without understanding the context. And I think to hear Tacan, talk specifically about the S-400 thing as a strategic mistake, of course it was. But you know what? France is the only NATO member that kicked NATO out. People forget about that, even though I think I'm the only person that was alive when that happened on this call. But the French kicked us out, and there have been plenty of other times where NATO allies did something that infuriated everybody else. The United States, we routinely irritate everybody. We irritated the British and the French when Eisenhower stopped them in Suez. Turkey irritated us when they would not allow us to attack Iraq through Turkey. I'm old enough to have been a lieutenant in Germany, West Germany, when we deployed Pershing II, and hundreds of thousands of German protesters came out and complained. So I think there's too much attention on Turkey as for whatever their sins might be. The fact is, all of us, everybody in NATO has been at war with at least 1, 2, or 3 other members of the alliance throughout our history. And doing the hard work of NATO, and both Oana and Tacan have done this in person, protecting the cohesion of the alliance, figuring out how to address every nation's issues and concerns, and still it stays together. This is why it's been Russia's objective since 1949 to drive this wedge between U.S. and Europe and to break apart our great alliance. And it's the incredible hard work of ambassadors and generals and admirals to keep it together. That's important. That's what I focus on. Now, I would say this. There definitely is a need for a USA-Turkey 2.0. I think our tendency is to kind of surf in and out of Turkey a little bit because it seems to be off in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. We don't think about it. The U.S. boundary between U.S. European Command and Central Command is the border between Turkey and Syria. I mean, you would have to try very hard to find a worse place to have the boundary between 2 combatant commands than the border between Turkey and Syria. But that affects how we think about the region in the Pentagon. And I think rebuilding some trust and confidence and being consistently there, not just occasionally when we need Turkey. But I think Turkey also probably could be more consistent. I mean, there are times it seems to me they do things when it's convenient, but look the other way when it's not. I think Turkey could play a much better role in helping to stop this illegal shadow fleet that Russia uses to get oil and gas out of the Black Sea, just like it does in the Baltic Sea, by the way. So working with our allies in both the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea to stop, disrupt, hinder Russia's ability to export oil and gas in these illegal vessels that are environmental disasters waiting to happen, which is the only way they can keep their war effort going. I think Turkey could play a stronger role here.
Thank you, Ben. I agree. I absolutely agree with you on the issue of the fleet. And I hope we can come back to the issue of the Black Sea in a moment, because there was also the new EU strategy, if we can call it a strategy, that came out a couple of days ago. But I just want to come back to you, Oana, to stick on actually the issue of European security against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, because there's been many conversations ongoing vis-a-vis coalitions of the willing. I mean, Turkey's been engaged in some of them. It hasn't been in all of them. But how would you view Turkey in terms of being potentially engaged in different coalitions? Is this something that should be like a strategic imperative for Europe, particularly given the size and skills of the Turkish armed forces?
Yeah, I think it's been smart of France and the UK, together with Germany and other big European NATO allies involved in these meetings about a potential coalition of building for Ukraine to involve Turkey. There's been a lot of conversations also in view of the sheer size and capability of the Turkish armed forces, that they could, for instance, play a key role when it comes to a potential maritime component, with France and the UK perhaps playing a more important role when it comes to air and land. But Ben, I'm sure we'll have much more on that. But I think, just to take a step back, looking at Turkey's role when it comes to Ukraine, absolutely. On the one hand, we have this very strange bromance between President Erdogan and President Putin, but then we also have a very similar strange bromance between President Trump and President Putin. So there's a lot of that. And actually, to some extent, between President Trump and President Erdogan, we've heard a lot of praise from President Trump about President Erdogan. So there's a lot of this backslapping among big, powerful men. There's also been the fact that Turkey hasn't really applied sanctions against Russia, and some would argue has actually benefited economically from them quite substantially. On the other hand, we should not forget Turkey's absolutely key role we see today as a convener of political talks, but also in dealing with hostage, prisoner of war exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. The grain deal, absolutely key, the grain corridor, and of course closing the Black Sea through its control of the Montreux Convention, which basically enabled the Ukrainian armed forces, without a navy of themselves, to take out about half of Russia's Black Sea fleet. So I think Turkey has played a key role and will continue to play a key role. And I think in the Black Sea in particular, for instance, we've recently seen a big NATO exercise just a couple of months ago, together, for instance, with Greece, but also with the US, with France, with the UK, with Romania, with Bulgaria. So I think as the center and as the key power in the Black Sea region, I think it can serve as a very useful platform for engagement with other EU and NATO allies, but also in particular with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova.
Thank you, Oana. I want to just come back to you now, Murat. Again, related more specifically to the shape of a new European security, or a different type of NATO, because there have been some discussions over perhaps NATO becoming more of a Europe-led institution if there was a reduction of presence by the United States. How do you think this would be viewed by Turkey, to have a sort of more Europe-led NATO?
Well, I think it sort of goes back to the question of when we discuss if Turkey has different options or not. There is one clear point, is that Turkey doesn't seem to have many different options, because actually, while reorienting its strategy, Turkey was checking different options. And as the other speakers already discussed, there's certain ties with maybe Russia and China, but it's very clear that this doesn't mean an alliance with these countries. And such an alliance is not really possible. But more importantly, also, I think cooperation with Russia is one thing, and a genuine alliance with Russia is another. I mean, if you look at the regions where both countries are active, like the Balkans, Black Sea, Caucasus, Middle East, Central Asia, Eastern Mediterranean, name it, you will see that Turkish and Russian interests are always in clash, not aligned. And historically as well, Russia has posed a major threat to Turkey. I mean, one of the reasons maybe today two countries can also have this equal relationship is also thanks to NATO. I mean, as Oana mentioned, Bosphorus and Dardanelles, they are, for example, very important for Russia. And in a strategy, in a scenario that Turkey is out of the Western security architecture, make it NATO or the newly emerging European one, of course, Russia would have direct demands from Turkey. And one of the first ones will probably on Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which are creating actually enormous trouble for the Russian naval movement from and to Black Sea. So considering all these points, I believe that Turkey realizes, and the current government as well, that Turkey needs to be actually part of the Western alliance, and that's the only viable and strategic choice. And in a situation that there is a trouble within NATO because of President Trump, and with all these new efforts to create a new European security architecture, Turkey definitely wants to be part of this, and not only a partner which is in the second layer of the partnership or alliance, but in the center of this new security alliance as well. But in any case, this is something has to come in close coordination and cooperation with NATO as well. I mean, European Union may try, obviously, to create its own security, its own defense strategy. However, actually, the NATO partners are the ones making Europe secure today. And three of them are actually not EU member states. One is UK, one is Turkey, and Norway. So you cannot really plan European security. You cannot really create a European army, if you want to call it this way, without cooperating with these countries, because then you have no chance. So actually, this is a reciprocal need. There's a clear mutual interest for cooperating. But as I said in the first part, I think to what level Turkey will be involved in this, it also depends on Turkey's choices in terms of where the country would like to go, and also in terms of democracy and values.
Maybe I can come back with a final question to Ambassador on this point. Where do you see Turkey would like to position itself, Ambassador, in this potential future new European security architecture? What role do you see for Turkey there?
Well, first of all, it would be important to maintain unity and cohesion within NATO, also maintaining the transatlantic bond. It has been contributing to the success of NATO in the last more than 75 years, and therefore I personally hope that the upcoming The Hague summit meeting will provide all of us a solid basis to look to the future with what we have had so far, with such unity and cohesion and transatlantic bond to remain intact. Now, as to the European security and the strategic responsibility of European states, because I try to distance myself from the terminology strategic autonomy, but rather prefer strategic responsibility. It is good if European states increase their contribution to defense. There is certainly an issue, burden sharing. Since 2014, NATO has been doing a lot with the defense investment pledge. But we all know that given the current circumstances, it is not enough. And probably in Hague, we will see not a pledge, but a clear commitment, reaching to 5%, 3.5 plus 1.5, maybe by 2032. So it's good if Europeans create more capabilities, which would be needed. It's great, but EU-centric security architecture or arrangement would be something Turkey would be approaching with utmost caution, because we know that in such a denomination, inclusivity may become an issue. And to develop a European pillar within NATO is a sensible thing. Of course, it shouldn't be to create a EU caucus within NATO, because as the former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, to whom we worked together with Oana, he was repeating time and again that there are allies like the United Kingdom, Norway, and Turkey making enormous contributions to European security and defense. So inclusivity is one keyword. And for Turkey also, complementarity is something to do that it can accept, but competition would be not something to favor. For the European Union, there are a couple of things for them to take into account. First, NATO should remain as the cornerstone of European defense. There is no doubt about it. And hopefully, with a clear understanding with our American friends that this transatlantic bond would be maintained. Second, capability development is important. We welcome the decision and legislative changes of Germany to make funds available for defense spending. But it is not just a matter of allocating more money, but also to find sources to procure enough systems, weapons that are needed. That brings me to the crucial role of Turkey with its defense industrial base. There are European Union initiatives like European Defense Fund, PESCO, SAFE, and it would be a strategic thinking for the European Union not to exclude but include Turkey in the picture. But unfortunately, the European Union usually agrees on lowest common denominator, guided by national interests and priorities of some of its members. And I think if the European Union wants to have an important responsibility and share for European security and play its geopolitical role, then it should be open-minded to include countries like Turkey and Norway and the United Kingdom. There has been a long-standing commitment on the part of the European Union to fully involve non-EU allies for NATO-EU cooperation to be as we wish to see it. So more European share is important, but we always should remember that Europe is more than the European Union.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would also like Oana to comment on the issue of Turkey being engaged in these EU initiatives. I mean, I agree with the Ambassador. Do you see the EU moving in this direction? And I'm going to ask everybody to be very, very short in their answers now, because I want there's a few questions related to the Black Sea and other issues I would like to put.
I'm not sure. I don't think the EU has finally agreed on which particular direction to go when it comes to especially the rearm initiative, which is now the big discussion, the 150 billion euros. But I would agree with Tacan that it would be short-sighted if there is no engagement with Turkey in some shape or other, in some percentage or other, because I would say I would state that this would help European countries procure the equipment they need at scale and at speed, as well as the involvement of the UK and Norway, of course. And the reality is that individual nations, which are members of both NATO and the EU, are actually already engaging with Turkish defense industry. And I would just mention Estonia, Poland, Romania, Spain, Portugal, on things like frigates, logistics vessels, drones, and trainer aircraft. So that cooperation is already happening bilaterally.
Thank you, Oana. We have a couple of questions here related to the Black Sea that I want to put to you, Ben. I mean, first to comment on the communication. I've got told off for calling it a strategy. It's a communication from the EU, but also from Alper Coşkun, who is asking or saying both the US and EU are working on Black Sea strategies. Neither have advanced this work by fully engaging Turkey and looking for synergies. Is there room for Ankara and Washington to work in this area more closely, recognizing Turkey's desire to be a leading NATO actor? And can they use such a momentum to build synergies within the EU Black Sea strategy / communication, whatever you frame it at the moment?
Was that one question, or?
It was a combination of two questions from Andre de Munta and Alper.
So, you know, thinking about a Black Sea strategy without Turkey is like, you know, talking about the High North without Norway or any other kind of thing. It's infeasible to think about a Black Sea strategy where Turkey does not play an essential role, but also, of course, Romania does. I think what's always been missing from the different discussions and pushes for a Black Sea strategy is why? I mean, for what? And you know, what is the end state of the strategy? What do we want? And clearly, the key parts of it would be about respect for sovereignty, freedom of navigation, and the economic development of the Black Sea as an east-west economic corridor between Europe and Eurasia, which means you have to think about the Caucasus, of course, you know, and Georgia and Azerbaijan, the critical role they would play. And so there's been this tendency, we talk about parts or countries around the Black Sea as if they are islands. You know, Romania, an island, Georgia, an island, instead of all being parts of a strategically important region that seems far off to many people. I think that we're lucky, even though it's frustrating at times, we're lucky that Turkey has Montreux Convention authority and is able to dictate what military capabilities can go in and out of there. And, you know, I've always had friends would say, oh, we got to find a way around Montreux. And for what? I mean, we could never, even before Russia's large-scale invasion in 2022, we never came close to using up all of the capacity for U.S. and Royal Navy and German Navy and French, et cetera, ships that we could have gotten into the Black Sea because it was not a high enough priority. I mean, I think if Admiral Fogel was on the net now, he would tell you that maybe he got close to 50% of the maximum number of ships he could have ever gotten into the Black Sea. So you have to have a strategic outcome you're trying to achieve, and then you can get policies and allocate resources. So I think those are the things that are missing. Turkey is not the problem with the Black Sea strategy. I think it's more us deciding what are we trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think it would be also a good idea to try and put some meat on the bone of what was published yesterday or the day before would be actually a good starting point as well. But I want to come to you now, Murat, perhaps for the last question, because we're running out of time. From an anonymous attendee, if European and NATO allies exclude Turkey from critical defense cooperation and technology sharing, how could the international community interpret Turkey's potential turn towards non-NATO partners to sustain its defense innovation and strategic autonomy? Would this shift be viewed as a necessity for national security or divergence from allied cohesion? I guess we can also take into consideration Turkey's own evolving defense sector here, which is quite accelerating its speed.
I mean, of course, including Turkey is very important in this programs and the emerging European programs as well. But it's not about excluding or including Turkey, because many actually Turkish defense companies, they are already either part of European structures or they are trying to be part of the European structures through different ways. Some through joint ventures, partnerships, investments. When you talk to those companies, they are all actually on the way to become an European firm. They try to look for ways because they do business globally, but their clear preference is to engage more deeply with Europe. This is, of course, a pragmatic move. It offers opportunities for growth, investment, collaboration, but it's not just about pragmatism. There's also a strategic dimension to it. So these companies see themselves as European players, and whatever the EU's decision will be, actually, these companies are dynamic and they will find ways of becoming part of these structures. There are a lot of cliches about Turkish defense sector, but clearly the Turkish defense industry is really very rapidly growing. It will probably become the largest sector in the country. And despite the cliches, no, they are not there only thanks to the AKP and its policies. No, all defense companies are not actually pro-government. And also, no, Turkish defense sector is not all about drones. While drones are very important, we saw it one more time yesterday, but these companies are actually really producing high technology for different defense areas, and we need to actually include them because that's an advantage for the future of Europe. I mean, many European countries, including Germany, they would like to speed up this process, but Turkey is already one step ahead. So it's only in their profit if they cooperate, if they find ways of cooperation with this Turkish defense companies so that they can build their capacities in a much quicker way.
Thank you, Murat. I have a couple of last questions here for the ambassador. There is one about whether he would foresee in the future a Turkish Secretary General of NATO. That's a nice thought. I'll leave that up to you if you want to comment. But the other question is, how do you see the efforts for a European nuclear umbrella?
Well, first of all, if I may say a few words on Black Sea security, since the think tank that I chair, Ildem, together with our Romanian and Bulgarian partners, Sofia Security Forum and News Strategy Center, we produced two reports, one on Black Sea security, the other one on Black Sea energy security. What I want to highlight is that regional ownership is an important element to take into consideration. Those who are in search of a strategy or in preparing a strategy, I don't know to what extent they were consulting with the riparian states. Of course, those who are within the European Union might have added their voices, but I don't know whether Turkey was consulted or not, being an important player in the region. In any case, regional ownership is important, and there are tangible results already with the mine countermeasure task force that Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey already put in place, functioning, and it may enlarge to different spheres of activity. And also, we need to see the specificities of the region with protracted conflicts, and also see the geographical continuum, not consider it as an isolated geographical space, but connected to other regions. This brings us to the connectivity issue. Now, for implementing sanctions of both the United States and the European Union, you are right, Turkey has not been implementing these measures. Nevertheless, it has been Turkey's long-standing policy only to implement UN sanctions, but not the rest. And if there are some of the policies that Turkey has implemented countering these sanctions, we always received some warnings coming from different capitals. And I think Turkey was managing its course of action by calibrating those policies, like in the case of Russian Mir, first was used as a system of payment, but later, with the warning of both Washington and the EU, Turkey decided not to take Russian Mir payment system as a valid system. So for nuclear umbrella, I don't want to speculate at this point on how it could be a European nuclear umbrella. We have in place the nuclear sharing arrangements of NATO, and I hope that it will remain to be responding to the security requirement of all allies. So for me, it is quite early even to speculate on this. Let us hope that what we have right now will continue to be valid for the future.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with that, I need to wrap up this webinar because we already went a couple of minutes over time. I would like to thank all of you for coming and sharing your insights. I think the topic has many more niches to actually explore. Turkish foreign and security policy will always be something that's of huge interest to everyone. So thank you again for coming. The next edition of our series will actually be specifically looking at Turkey and the Black Sea, as the Black Sea has been put on the radar again, not just because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but because, as was mentioned, these new strategies that are coming out in a way they never did before, and certainly need to be further dug into and analyzed. So to the audience, thank you for joining. Please do join us on the next session. And to everybody, good evening from here in Kiev, and a good evening to where you all are today, or good morning if you're on the other side of the Atlantic. Bye-bye.
Okay.